Well, hello, dear friends. Welcome to this episode, very special episode of Fantasy for Our Time. This is the final in our mini-series discussing the great cultural event of our time, or so some news outlets would want us to have it. And it's been kind of interesting how, well, we'll talk about that. But yes, there's been a real concerted effort to make this into the Star Wars of our time, and it's not working. I hate to tell you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because a lot of news outlets now, I mean, even like The Guardian, Rolling Stone, etc., are coming out and being like, this first season was not that great, you guys.
Yes, that Guardian article was excellent.
Yeah, which is good because otherwise they won't fix things. So
yes, it will take the pandering access media saying things like this for actually some things to be changed. And to start with, on a good positive note, this should not be a positive note, what I'm about to say. And we really haven't even finished the intro, but who cares? Richard Rowland, hello. I'm Nicholas Kochar. Hi, everybody. We are just jumping right into this thing.
I assume everybody who's paying attention to these reviews knows me by now. So
yes, I should hope so.
Yeah.
So there was this thing, among the many things we're going to talk about today, that I read. Patrick Payne, is it Patrick? Whatever, Mr. Payne.
Yes.
One of the writers was talking about how, was asked the question, do you have the whole 5 seasons scripted out? And he said something very revealing that I thought was hilarious, because on the one hand, it should really make you afraid, because what he said was, yeah, we have the basic ideas down, but we have enough flexibility built in to the way that we've scripted the story over 5 seasons, that in case some character or actor catches our fancy, or some relationship between actors comes out as unexpectedly interesting, we're going to write that in. So initially I'm like, well, what are you doing? Like, this is not how you write 5 seasons worth of a show that is going to have a cohesive and a complete story. It's a recipe for disaster. On the other hand, it also, I think they might be saying that because they're not allowed to say this, of course, out loud, but maybe they are suggesting that perhaps there is room for improvement and that they'll be learning on the job, which, let's take out the positive and say, maybe this is something that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, so this is the thing. There are several shows that I actually really like the show, but the first season is not great. Babylon 5 is that way. I actually really love Babylon 5, and there's some aspects about season 1 of Babylon 5 that I like, but also like the whole reason you watch season 1 of Babylon 5 so you can get to season 2 of Babylon 5.
That's good to know.
Fringe, which is another TV show that I really enjoyed back when it came out, same kind of a thing where the first season is kind of skippable. It's not really very important at all. But then the show becomes pretty good, and comes as close to paying off. Doesn't totally pay off, but comes as close to paying off the puzzle box thing as any puzzle box show can. And it still gets really bogged down by about the second to last and final seasons, to where it's like, okay, yes, I know that we have to go find the next key in the sequence. Can we just get there, and like you're invested in it because you care about the characters. The actual plot you could kind of take or leave, but anyway, all that to say, so one can hope that future seasons, which I'm not sure I'll watch, but
we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that. I'm kind of, I'm not gonna say no, but I'm gonna we'll just kind of see where things are, and because I think they're saying it'd be like another 2 or 3 years before they put out another season. So,
and a lot of things can happen in 2 years, as we know.
Yeah. So on the one hand, you could look at that and say, all right, well, maybe they'll learn from some of the mistakes they made in season 1 and go on to season 2. On the other hand, it just needs to be remembered, this is not some little sci-fi channel low budget production that where you can say, okay, well, that looks bad, or that was kind of cheesy or something, but you know what, I can just appreciate it for what it is. This is the most expensive television show ever created.
Yes,
the most expensive, to like literally $60 million an episode.
It's mind-boggling.
And so it's $60 million an episode, we're justified, I think, in holding this thing to a little bit higher of a standard. You shouldn't have rookie showrunners on a project like this.
Yes.
I don't know whose decision that was, but that person is probably not having a great month right now. Especially some of
I bet you
these.
it was Bezos himself. And
Who knows? Who
it's
even
these
knows?
multi-billionaire people. They have to take big risks, and sometimes those big risks don't pan out. But that's how they make.
But
their
they
living.
shouldn't have brought in rookie showrunners. They shouldn't have. Well, there are a lot of things they shouldn't have done. But at the end of the day, kind of a lot of the problems stem from with the show for me really stem from things that can probably be chalked up to a deep lack of experience on the one hand, and then also obviously just let's say a totally different goal in storytelling, a totally different goal in making this series than the ones that I was hoping they would have and the ones that I was expecting as a fan.
Yeah, that's very fair. We're going to be breaking all of these points down in more detail as we go through the final episode and talk about the season as a whole. And let's start with our first impressions of the last episode. And I'll start because I'll get through them quickly. I actually thought that the first 15-20 minutes or so of the episode were some of the best in the show, just taken separately from any reference to the lore at large. So if we're just looking at this, and I was actually able to do this at a certain point. I think at a certain point before I started watching the final episode, I was trying to convince myself that I was going to try to enjoy this on its own merits without pretending like this was actually Tolkien. This is just a sci-fi show, a fantasy show. So let's see how that goes. And the initial part was fairly okay for me. I thought the pace was good. I thought the writing was a little bit better. And then the wizard duel happened, and I wanted to bash my head against the wall. We'll talk about that in a bit. But there were a few things that I liked. So the pace was good. It seemed like finally we're going to get to something exciting before it all broke down, of course. And also I thought that some of the good things that we had talked about before were reinforced here. In particular, they do seem to be making some attempt to articulate a kind of theological vision that is good. So in particular, when Nori says, in a rather simplistic way, yes, but still the truth is there, that you are not who they say you are, something, but you are what you do. So basically your virtue depends on your actions and not on what everybody else expects of you, right?
Batman said it better, but yes.
Clearly.
Yeah.
I think you can stick that sentence will work. That's a very useful sentence.
That moment, yes, Batman said it better. No, that moment in Batman Begins, where kind of the recurring theme of that particular film is, it's not who I am on the inside, but it's what I do that defines me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that actually could work if you were to actually craft the Galadriel thing about how the internal darkness can have external manifestations they don't expect, which should in theory be a good thing. Like I actually like the idea of exploring, as a fantasy writer, I like the idea of having a main character whose internal darkness is so overwhelming that it causes unexpected damage on the outside. Now, we talked about this. It shouldn't have been Galadriel. That making Galadriel into this character is extremely, extremely, extremely problematic. And we'll get into detail on this because effectively, I will throw this out right now. She is the villain of the show. Galadriel is the
so
villain
far 100%.
She is the villain. Nobody is as bad as Galadriel. She's evil. Period. And reinforced by I'm not going to get into the details anyway. So I like that Nori said that. That was also cheapened, unfortunately, by Gandalf, and it is Gandalf. I think we can pretty much agree it's Gandalf, which is dumb. Gandalf saying, "I'm good." And,
oh my goodness, this line.
Let's just add that to the sea is always right, and all the other lines that should be crossed forever out of our
goodness. Memory. It was so dumb.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to the wizard duel thing because I think it's very. It just goes back to a profound misunderstanding of magic in Tolkien's Legendarium and why the Legendarium isn't really a fantasy work the way that it's understood now. And something the Jackson films misunderstood in places, but we all sort of collectively agree to forget about them.
Right, and now this is the part, the two stupidest scenes in the well, among a few, but the two of the stupidest scenes in the Peter Jackson trilogy are the stupid moth and the stupid wizard duel, and both make an appearance in this
as like the most
episode.
defining thing about Gandalf
Yes.
as a character. He has moth
Yes.
powers. Don't you know that? He turns things into moths. He talks to moths. Like, where is the moth thing coming from?
I
Like,
don't know. Silence of the
but
Lambs. I mean, I feel like they've got their thing all wrong.
anyway, okay, so yeah, but that line, that I'm good,
Yeah.
dude, come on, please. I'm
Just
I'm
stop.
begging you. I'm begging you. Just like
Stop.
hire new writers.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on that they were like, this would be a cool line if he just shouts, I'm good. But yeah, I mean, this just goes back to my biggest complaint with this whole show, really, which I think has been the dialogue. It's been very frustrating because it undercuts and undermines anytime something is you know how like especially in the current, kind of let's say the twilight years of the MCU now,
Mm-hmm.
every important story beat is plagued by just like a really off key,
Yes.
off like really off key bit of humor,
It's
which
usually snarky.
prevents
It's usually
right,
self-referential. Yeah.
usually snarky, which always prevents us from actually experiencing any real pathos in the moment, right?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
show does that, but unintentionally.
Yes.
Every time something important is happening and there's like a build to right, action, I'm like, okay, I'm getting into this. There's just a really, really dumb line that undercuts all of it for me. And it's like, well, like you didn't have to yell. Like if a character has to yell the words "I'm good" so that the audience knows, that is some bad writing.
And we've talked about this before. This is a recurring issue. The writers don't seem to be able to trust the audience in any real way. So yeah, those were my thoughts about my initial thoughts about the final episode. The rest we will discuss in far greater detail. But did you have anything specific about the last episode that you want to say before we get into the more thematic stuff?
I agree that the pacing was better than the episode before it. Basically, as far as pacing goes, they've been about every other episode has been okay.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah.
It's which tells me that the writers are in some kind of a weird rhythm that they need to get unstuck from. I don't know their process or whatever, but yeah, pretty much every other episode I found has had kind of decent pacing as far as keeping the story going, showing us things. There has been there wasn't. I'm just trying to think back through the episode and find other things to praise.
See, we're trying, people.
I really am, and I'm trying not to be. Somebody told me the other day I was being like just absolutely cynical about this whole thing. I was like, well,
no, you're
I
not.
don't think I am. I'm not a cynical person. I really wanted this thing to be good, and I have tried to look for the things to praise. But it is very frustrating to kind of see. It's not just, and I feel like I have to keep saying this, but it's not just that, oh, they didn't do the lore the way I wanted them to or something like that. But I'm, I stopped caring. Like I stopped looking at that several episodes ago. And the things I've been paying attention to have really been just like storytelling beats, dialogue, like
character development,
etc. And there is some good stuff in that regard in this episode. But it just kind of feels too little too late.
Plus, a lot of the really good stuff in this episode in particular is only good. And if this episode existed in a vacuum, I think there'd be a lot more good to say about it. But the stuff that seems to work is directly referential to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. There are scenes here that are they're not beat for beat, but they're very clearly meant to evoke visually, rhythmically, in terms of dialogue, in terms of the characters involved. It's very clearly some kind of homage or some kind, I don't know what you would even call it. And so the goodbye, Nori's goodbye scene, for example, right, where Poppy comes back, that sort of thing should be affecting and should be beautiful, right? And because it's such a human thing, right? You're leaving your tribe and you're going to go with this stranger who's possibly, dangerous, very dangerous, and you're going off into goodness knows where, distant land, when your entire life you've been told never go off trail, or etc. Right? And
nobody walks alone.
Nobody walks alone. Yeah. And here your friend is going to come. It's supposed to be this beautiful scene. But of course, recall that incredible final scene in The Fellowship of the Ring in Peter Jackson's version, where Sam says, I'm coming with you. I mean, like, just the pacing of it, the way that the beats of the dialogue, the acting, the music. It's one of the greatest scenes of cinema, I think. I think it's incredible. I agree that I think that Sam kind of sinking for 3.5 seconds, maybe a little too much. But if you take away Sam sinking and looking up into the light, the rest of that is just, it's one of the greatest scenes of all time.
Yeah.
So if you're going to reference that, make it different enough where the reference point is like, oh, that's cool, right? But then it stands on its own feet. Doesn't do that here. There is no emotional resonance in that scene at all. And all I'm left to think of is, well, you guys have been telling us the diversity is good. So what am I supposed to be thinking here? Am I supposed to be thinking that this is Frodo and Sam, or am I supposed to be thinking that this is the introduction of the first queer romance in the Lord of the Rings universe? Hurrah! Right? Is that what I'm supposed to be thinking? Because I've been trained now to think that all my normal thoughts that come from normal impressions are wrong, and I'm a terrible racist, and I'm a horrible human being, and shut up. So, but what am I don't get what I'm supposed to be feeling anymore.
Yeah. And so here's the other thing. Even the stuff that was kind of interesting and cool was undermined by let's say like, this entire first season should have been about 3 episodes.
Yes.
Like, this whole season's been 5 episodes too long, right? You said in our last review, the whole Stranger, / Harfoot story arc could have played out in 1 episode.
Easy.
The whole basically nothing Galadriel has done on screen has actually been essential to the plot. I mean, if you think about it, almost nothing she's done, except as a means to introduce Sauron, I guess.
Yeah.
Almost nothing she's done has actually been essential to the plot. She just shows up places and ruins things and then goes other places. So nothing she's done has really been essential to driving the plot forward. You could have done elves are fading. Yeah. Guy shows up and he's like, hey, I could help you forge your ring. I could help you forge this mithril. You could have literally just done that and without Galadriel, any of the, chasing Galadriel all over the place. No, totally. Yeah. And so I think that's what really frustrated me, is how very little most of the actions of the characters in the show mattered. Right. And this is kind of classic bad writing or amateurish writing, is saying, hey, listen, I've got all these scenes. Wouldn't it be cool if ... And you do all those scenes, but none of it is actually moving things forward. And so now we have enough of a first season that we can look at the arc of the first season and say, okay, what was the arc of the first season? It was to get us to this particular moment. Well, what would have actually been necessary to get us to this particular moment? Galadriel swimming, not necessary. Galadriel going to Numenor, not necessary. You could have brought Numenor in and still had the Numenorians show up in Middle Earth without Galadriel showing up there, right? So the only purpose Galadriel has served, as you said, is to kind of become the villain of the piece, but in a way that she's not a compelling villain, right? More of in a way where she is a she's like a B plot villain, right? Her job was to just be the villain that the heroes fight early on to drive the story forward. Except of course there are no real heroes to kind of do that.
Except maybe Adar.
I mean, well, he's definitely the most heroically portrayed character in the show in terms of having
clearest set of motivations.
Has a clear set of motivations, real struggles that they overcome, and then a conclusion that they reach. Now, I will say, I thought that I kind of love the B plot of like secret elven detective Elrond, and I am quite actually happy with the way that they have kind of unwound things about his half elven lineage as
Mhm.
the show has gone. You know, it was
Yeah.
a complaint that I had early on that they didn't mention any of that, and then they surprised me by actually kind of stretching it out in a way that didn't feel like super obvious or like fan service or something like that, but just like drop a little bit here and there. Oh, that's
Yeah.
really nice.
Yeah. Agreed.
I really like that. He's not a good detective. You know, he just literally notices things that are super obvious, but other people have failed to notice them.
And he reads
Um,
lips well.
right. He reads lips and he picks up things that other people have dropped.
Mhm.
But even so, he's still like the most observant character in the show.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of like a fun my I think that's a cool thing. I think these people don't have a good sense of how to write mysteries well, despite doing like their whole thing as a
Puzzle
mystery
box.
box,
Yeah.
as a puzzle box, right? They don't have a good sense of how to, you know, if you gave them like here, make a murder mystery, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, uh, I think that they would, you know, they'd probably really struggle with one that, you know, had a satisfying arc. But
Yeah.
for all that, like I said, I enjoyed kind of Elrond's role in this. I think that character has been at least consistently decent
Mhm.
throughout the whole show. Enough that I have stopped paying attention to his hair, which is really saying
Yeah.
something.
Actually, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, like
Yes.
at first I
Sometime
was like,
episode 5, I
"This
stopped
goofy
paying
hair,"
attention. Yeah.
but you know, eventually I was like, okay, that's fine. Um, so those are things that, you know, some things I found useful or praiseworthy about this episode. Um, we'll get to the stuff that really
Yeah.
frustrated me in a minute, I guess. But there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. Okay. So leading from that, there was a charge leveled at us critics. And by the way, there's just as a side note, there is a tremendous amount of hand wringing going on about people criticizing the show that I find fairly annoying. I'm just going to leave it there. It's annoying.
Again, guys, Amazon is they're a
Yeah.
very large evil mega corporation. They can take care of themselves. You
And
don't have to.
no, you don't. And the point is, they didn't do a good job with the production on this. It's clear they
Right,
didn't do a good job. And
right.
I found interesting little tidbit, by the way, before we get into the next section, that I'm not going to name names here or anything, but I was talking to somebody who has some intimate knowledge with the production, somebody who was involved with the production on a limited level. And this person made it very clear that the director of, not the writers, but the director chosen for this show has absolutely no interest in visuals, that this is a director who is not a visual director. Like that's not his thing. Um, and Peter Jackson very much is. So
Sure,
in
yeah.
for all the minuses that you do have in some of the characterization, two things that Peter Jackson did very well was, one, he insisted he would never put in his own personal agenda into Tolkien's work, something that unfortunately has happened in Rings of Power. And two, he was a very powerfully visual director who managed to create um, some of the most memorable scenes in cinematic history, I think. So both of that, so that's not there. That's not happening. It's a real miss, and it's a real pity. So I hope that that's something that they might be able to fix in the future, because I don't think there's any need to have the same director from year in year out. Directors in television
Yeah,
programs aren't all that important.
yeah.
Okay, so all that said, one of the criticisms that has been leveled to people like us is that slow pacing, etc., things like this. Tolkien is slow paced. The sagas are slow paced. Have you ever read the Kalevala? Yes, I have. But they're slow paced. So this slow pacing is actually a medieval storytelling device. This was actually something that somebody said on one of these forums. So I thought, let's steel man this. All right. Let's pretend that this might actually be the case, because there is an argument to be made. And let's decide whether or not this argument is valid, Richard. That the kind of storytelling where you are frequently referencing previous works. In this case, since it's a visual medium, you're going to have visual cues, you're going to have audio cues, you're going to have stuff like that, musical cues, right? Repeated dialogue, visual cues like the Wizard's Duel, things like this, right? Maybe this is actually these guys' attempt to make a medieval form of art where, in medieval hagiographies, you constantly have repeated tropes and patterns. Medieval style fairy tales, you're going to have frequently repeated patterns because the readers know what to expect, right? This kind of typology is something that is to be expected in ancient literature. So is that what we're seeing here, Richard? What do you think?
So, do you know how many bad stories were written in the Middle Ages? I'm going to start here because this is something C.S. Lewis talks about in The Discarded Image, which is really important work if you want to understand the Middle Ages. Lewis notes in The Discarded Image that not all medieval literature is of quality. And in general, the stuff that most of us like read and reread and things like this, the stuff that makes, the syllabus, right? Chaucer and whatever, is that's the good stuff, right? And because it's good, people have found value in it and they've returned to it again and again. But for every Chaucer, right, there were 5 or 10 people who were rewriting exactly the same stories Chaucer was rewriting, because Chaucer was rewriting a bunch of Italian stories, as was Shakespeare, for that matter.
Yep.
And who were rewriting all the same stories that Chaucer was rewriting, but they weren't any good, and so nobody reads them anymore. Okay. Yep. So Lewis says that the reason very often medieval literature failed, and this is really important to understand, it's really important for us to understand as Christian content creators as well, is that people sort of sometimes assumed, well, if I'm writing about a subject that is worthwhile, this is religious, this is, has to do with, the classics, that has to do with virtue, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm writing something which is worthwhile, then it doesn't really matter how good the quality is. Now, if anybody challenges that anybody would think like this, just go and think about every, evangelical film that's come out in the last 15 years. Right. Including, the ones that have, done relatively well for that kind of thing. Right. You can look at it and you can say, okay, I understand why this is popular with a certain demographic, the demographic I grew up with. So no hate there. But if you looked at this from the perspective of objectively, is this good writing? Is it good filmmaking? You would say, well, no. And here's why. And then you can list off the reasons. Okay.
Yep.
So just having subject matter and just being self-referential, these things don't necessarily lead to a good story. And
the presence of Easter eggs does not make good writing.
Right. In addition to this, there is obviously slow building pacing. For instance, in The Lord of the Rings, comparing it to the Kalevala, I think is not really fair, because the Kalevala is a different genre.
It's not a contained story.
It's not a contained story, and also, well, it's not actually medieval. It's not a contained story. It's not actually medieval. It's not a contained story, and it's not intended to drive a narrative forward. Right. So I love the Kalevala, but this, but it's not a useful comparison here. Do you know what would be a useful comparison here? The Odyssey. Do you know what has great, amazing pacing? The Odyssey, right? Now that's within the canons or the conventions of its genre, which is epic poetry. So we're going to spend a lot of time describing somebody's shield, for instance. But that's okay within, what we're doing. And I think for most of us, if there was like a really cool weapon or shield or something like that, and the camera lingered on it to show us, look at this really visually beautiful and interesting.
We'd love that.
Yeah, we'd be like, oh yeah, eat that up with a spoon, right? So so that said, the comparison here, if we look at The Lord of the Rings and ask the question, where is The Lord of the Ring seem to have slow pacing, right? It's really the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. And then maybe you could sort of argue the Council of Elrond chapter. Some people don't like that chapter. I'm not one of those people.
They're very wrong. So
they're super wrong, but the thing is, if you go back and you look at these chapters, Shadow of the Past, Council of Elrond, even all the Bombadil stuff, what you will actually find is there's not actually a moment of dull pacing. Now, there are some people who just don't like reading descriptions of landscapes, and if you don't like that, I can't help you.
Right.
And if one of my main complaints with Rings of Power is there was an insufficient number of beautiful landscapes, right? How often? I mean, Jackson understood this weirdly. I don't know why he understood this, because he's not this kind of filmmaker at all. But he or somebody who was close to him figured out one of the things we need to do to make Fellowship of the Ring feel like the Fellowship of the Ring is to do some of these walking shots, right?
Yeah.
Those walking shots do more for the world building, for the sense of, creating a sense of this is happening in Tolkien's Legendarium for somebody who's read the book than, 100 other things might have, right? And so if you go back and you actually look very closely at the early chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring, there is actually not a very much wasted time at all. It's all sort of building. Tolkien procedurally, methodically starts at this kind of calm center that is the Shire and builds outward from there. And as he does so, the pacing moves like an avalanche. So it's like a little trickle moving slowly at first, and then by the time you get to somewhere in the Two Towers, I mean, the book is just boom, chapter here, chapter here, chapter here, chapter here, back and forth. And at some point the party is split like 3 different ways, and Tolkien is always very careful about the perspectives that he uses for each of those shifts. It's very masterful. Well,
and all of that slow pacing, quote unquote, is it's the thing that makes the later chapters work as well as they do, right? So you couldn't have. So the problem with fast pacing and fast action is that you tend to lose connection with character, because you're going through stuff quickly and stuff is happening and people are dying, and it's difficult to have an emotional touch point. But by doing all that work in the initial chapters of The Lord of the Rings, where you have a very strong, rooted connection with the hobbits, and then providing the point of view is primarily of the hobbits throughout the rest of the story, that does an incredible thing, because it makes epic story grounded in the reality of very modern people who are very relatable. So it's actually quite brilliant.
And it makes it possible for us to grasp the sort of arresting strangeness as we move through these fairy realms and through these Anglo-Saxon mead halls and, through into this sort of like Romano-Byzantine culture of Gondor and all this, like as we're moving through these different cultures and these places and these realms, we have that grounding that goes back to the Shire. And, in every place they go, the hobbits are looking for things that make them feel like they're at home, right? And those little details about here's what they ate, and man, this elven food is really nice, but do you know what I would really like? I would like some bacon. I would like just a little bit of pipe tobacco.
How great was the scene in Isengard, Plots Majestum? It's one of the greatest chapters in the entire Lord of the Rings. It's so gorgeous.
An amazing chapter. It's so great. And Tolkien had this just wonderful ability to kind of communicate home comforts, or the lack thereof, something that probably only somebody who's lived through some rationing and shortages is able to really grasp or appreciate. So all that said, yes, I am never someone to complain about slow pacing. I'm I don't think I've complained about slow pacing in the show, and if I have, then I will just offer a correction to myself now and say what I really mean is let's say arrhythmic pacing, right? Where places where the rhythm seems off, where it feels like you're missing the beats that you should be hitting, or the beats that you are hitting, you're like banging a hammer really loudly so you can say, hey, look, we're hitting this classic story beat now. Did you guys all notice?
Right.
Exactly, so to sing the praises for a moment of Andor, I don't know, have you seen the most recent episode?
I got about halfway through before I had to prepare for today. So no, is it good?
I just watched the most recent episode last night with my wife.
Oh no, so this isn't, is this the you're talking about the heist scene?
Yes.
Okay, so because there's a new one that came out this morning.
Well, I didn't watch. I don't have.
Right, gotcha. Richard, the heist scene is one of the greatest movies ever made. It's so good.
I was just on the edge of my seat the entire time.
It is so good.
By the time it was the episode was over, it was like, I want another one. I want it right now. Like, this is so. I'm very invested in the show. I'm so invested in it, I've forgotten that it was Star Wars. That's how good it is.
Yes.
I don't say that because I dislike Star Wars, because I like Star Wars just fine. Yep. I'm only human. Space wizards with laser swords.
Come on.
I mean, come on, like you can't. Who could hate that, right?
Yeah.
But I'm so invested in the show. I'm like, I don't care that this has anything to do with Star Wars. This is just like, this is a good show.
Yeah.
And it's got incredibly slow pacing. The first three
episodes are so slow. They are so slow.
But the slowness doesn't bother me. I am not the kind of person who is bothered by slowness. In fact, I go to a church where we have a service called All Night Vigil.
That's right.
like slow is fine. Slow is fine.
Especially when you feel like you're in confident hands that know that they're doing this for a reason, and you really do. It pays off like crazy by episode 6.
Yes. So this is the thing. What I don't like is feeling like this is pointless.
Yeah.
We could have not done this and gotten to the same place.
Yeah.
And then I feel like
that a lot.
Wasted my time. You've wasted your time.
Mm-hmm.
You've spent a
wasted
whole lot of money.
$60 million.
and you've spent a whole lot of money doing not Tolkien. And okay, if we're going to do not Tolkien, could we at least do it well?
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of and so the show is kind of riddled with really offbeat pacing, not in like a Guy Ritchie kind of a way where it still seems to sort of work.
Depends on the
movie. Depends on the movie. His Man from U.N.C.L.E. is really, I think, a very underrated film. I know it didn't do well in the box office, but
I like it a lot. But
it holds up to rewatching. But yeah, like Guy Ritchie is a good example of somebody who has really offbeat pacing, but like sometimes he hits gold. But it's not that kind of offbeat pacing. It's just let's say an inattention. Inattention is probably the way that I would characterize it. It seems as though the showrunners or the director or something, I don't know, I've never made a film, which by the way doesn't mean you can't critique them. I saw somebody say this yesterday. Oh, well, I just like to see all these people who are critiquing it do something better. I'm like, well, that's not how this works. You're allowed to watch things and have opinions about them, even if you're not a filmmaker.
That's how it works. Those are the rules of the game. You don't get to just change the rules of the game because you're not happy with what we're saying. I'm sorry.
Right.
And everybody accepts these rules of the game. Everybody has always accepted the rules of the game, especially with the internet. I mean, this is how it works.
Right. Like I'm sure that person has opinions about things in which they are not an expert. But anyway, so what I really don't like is inattention and feeling like, okay, you're spending a bunch of time on something and there's not going to be payoff. And time again, this show has failed to deliver that payoff.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And it also, I think it can be extended to include the other aspects of this sort of the thing that the person was calling medieval storytelling, in that if you have repeated tropes and repeated images and repeated dialogue, and if you're deliberately trying to echo a kind of medieval effect, which I don't think they are. I think whoever said this is just being silly. But let's just, again, we're steel manning this. Let's just say that this is what they're trying to do. If the way it works really effectively is when the repetition resonates on a deeper level, not on the surface level. The surface level still has to be effective on its own, right? It has to be something that's worth having in the story, period. And then because it's effective on its own, and then you recognize that there is a deeper resonance through applicability to a different work, that deepens your appreciation of it and makes you go, okay, I really like this. This is the thing that drives me crazy about their inability to do Easter eggs properly. The reason Easter eggs work is because it's for that reason. It's not because only that it resonates with a past or other thing. It's because within the existing work, it calls back something that came before it, doubling the effect, not being the effect in and of itself. So there's a whole series of this thing, of these kinds of things that happened in the last episode. There's so many of them, in fact, that it's almost like, I don't know what they were doing. Like they'd saved them all up and just dumped them on our heads.
And some of them are hugely off key. For instance, when they're forging the rings, which is a very dumb scene.
It's so dumb. Oh my God. So dumb. You don't even have to be a silversmith to understand that this is just one of the stupidest depictions of smithing ever.
I don't need in my fantasy, let alone my Tolkien fantasy, adaptation. I don't need phrases like, "Oh, we put so much pressure in the pressure chamber. It should have been." No, like that's so tone deaf. Do you understand what genre you're doing? Like that's Star Trek level technobabble. It's fine in Star Trek.
Yes.
Don't put that in the Lord of the Rings. Come on.
No.
But when they're doing that scene at one point, like they're pouring all the mithril into like the vat and it's spinning because that's how that works.
Yeah.
And as it's spinning, like for a moment, you see the eye of Sauron.
There's an eye of Sauron.
And I'm like, so these are the elven rings with which Sauron's hand never touched.
Stupid.
He had nothing to do with.
They have nothing to do with the eye of Sauron. Nothing. Like, this is not the One Ring. Like, come on.
And so they were trying to do. Oh, look, guys, eye of Sauron. See, look, it's a reference, but did not understand the lore of the world well enough to have. Didn't understand the original story. Didn't understand the lore well enough to contextualize how that reference would best be done. And this gets me to go ahead.
No, it's the same thing that happens with the witches, with the three witches, right? Because they turn them into Nazgul. The image is a Nazgul. What does that have to do with anything? First of all,
wraiths because there are no rings yet.
Yes, and clearly they're not human. Clearly, there's some sort of shape-shifting angelic being of some kind. Why on earth are you making the Nazgul image? Because it's clearly, and of course, by the way, as a side note, I loved how somebody came up with the term Nazgal. I think Nazgal, brilliant. Yes.
Absolutely, quite fun. Quite fun.
And if that wasn't enough, they make one of the Nazgal's face into the moth. Like, wait, how many levels of fake resonance are we supposed to be having here? None of it makes sense. It's all stupid. It's just visual cues going like, oh, we know what we're doing, guys. Look, we know what we're doing. No, you're just proving to us that you have no idea what you're doing.
And so this is the thing. Those are things that are supposed to be callbacks. Yeah. But again, they don't mesh in any way
to the original context
of the original callback, right?
Right.
Medieval literature is full of examples of good ways to do this, right? Where you sort of build one reference on top of another reference.
Yeah. Palimpsest.
Yeah, right. And you can, and the scriptures are full of this, right? The New Testament, all throughout the New Testament. So I'm teaching for our parish Bible center, and I'm teaching through the Gospel according to St. Luke. And all throughout the Gospel of St. Luke and through the whole scriptures, obviously, even more in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, there are all these Old Testament references.
Right.
And they're always given in such a way that if I went back and looked at the original context of the Old Testament, the original context of that reference, where that psalm came from and what it's saying, et cetera, if I go back and look at those, it will actually tell me there's a sort of double illumination that happens.
Right,
the New Testament illumines
a
the
double
Old
resonance.
Testament. Yeah. And then also now I have some extra context. So you can, when Jesus says, but I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, that blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is a reference to a psalm. And if you go back and look at that psalm, you can see all the things that it's actually saying about who Jesus is, and therefore that Jesus is saying about who he is. But he's also telling us, here's how to read the psalm.
That's right.
And then, by the way, you can take that same psalm and look at where it shows up in the liturgy, especially in matins for Saturday or Sunday morning, and you get all kinds of resonances, right? So you can layer things, but if you layer things without just for the sake of layering them, without a context, without the ability to kind of make the context make sense, then it doesn't just come off as, I don't know, as bad. It comes off as ignorant.
Yeah. And those are harsh words, but it's true.
I mean,
it's true.
And so, I mean, that Eye of Sauron in the mithril vat is a perfect example, right? The whole deal with the elven rings. Yeah. And they even made a reference to this earlier, like 2 minutes earlier in the show, when Galadriel says, we're going to forge these. No other hand can touch these but ours, right? That's the writers making a nod to the fact that Sauron's hand, that Tolkien said that Celebrimbor forged these in secret. Sauron's hand never touched them, etc. Of course, they're also supposed to be forged last of the great rings, other than the one. But anyway, whatever. And not in a single afternoon either. I mean, these are the most powerful rings that. As long as you get the mithril loop going, man. Then like once you get that, you're fine, right?
Yeah, right.
And so we'll come back to that because I have strong words. Okay. But then 2 minutes after they said that, they show, ooh, look, Eye of Sauron. Ooh, isn't this mysterious? Isn't this ominous? Right.
Yeah.
And this goes to one of my deep frustrations. And this is one of the things that, I'll be honest, I've been having a really hard time with. which is there were a lot of people, many of them my friends, okay, who said, oh, well, we talked to the showrunners, we met with the showrunners, they really love Tolkien, and they really have a deep appreciation for the lore, and it's going to be great. And there's kind of a
where I don't see it.
There's kind of like a meta level where the plot of the first episode played out, where it's like the elves were deceived, y'all, like Amazon showed up bringing gifts and everybody was like, oh, cool, gifts. And then but people didn't sort of like, and again,
actually they're being so brilliant that they're making this play out on the stage of the society that we live in. Like the actual show,
this is actually
the world. This
is actually their plan with the Sauron character, according to the showrunners. Yes. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there's a really interesting quote that I want to read. So I felt a lot of frustration about this because it kind of feels like the Tolkien community in general, like there's this feeling of sort of being duped.
Yeah.
And it's totally unnecessary. It's like, are we so desperate for
apparently we are
attention and validation by the main dude, I mean, we have Tolkien, why do we care what Amazon thinks about us? Like, why do we care if they give us attention or not, or take us seriously or not? Like, it's just, so that's been really frustrating. Like, just on a personal level, that's been really frustrating. Yeah. Because you could look at this last episode and so many other things and say, okay, well, they don't actually understand the original stories. They don't understand the original lore. And even if they know the sequence of events, A, that's not the same thing as understanding them. And B, they don't care, right?
No, they don't.
They felt completely free to radically change important parts of the Legendarium,
including putting Gandalf in the Second Age.
Yeah, well, I'm not even timeline stuff, but just like radically change characters, radically change Galadriel's character, radically change Sauron's character.
Yeah.
And it's for no obvious benefit. And that's the thing that frustrates me, is that if they'd done it and it was a change, but then we could look at it and say, but this is a pretty good story, that'd be one thing.
Yeah.
But the result has been not a great story. And once again, this is the most expensive show ever made. They're not a low budget sci-fi channel production that, okay, I'm going to give them a pass because they're working on a cardboard set and the actors are acting their heart out.
Yeah, which is not happening, clearly.
Which is not
no, it's really frustrating. And it's almost like, and this is something that I've been thinking about, like, what are they trying to do with this? Like, what is the purpose of this? Is it merely, I mean, really, why did they make this show? I'm not sure that anybody really asked or answered that question. What was the purpose of making this show? Okay. Because initially it sounded like they're going to make a story about the Second Age, which is great. I think the Second Age has a lot of really interesting stuff you could mine. There's plenty of things you can do with it. If you're just focused on nothing but Numenor for an entire season, you could do so much stuff with that. But this episode seems to confirm that what they're actually doing is making a cinematic prequel to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. That actually there is no real necessary reference point to the larger Legendarium, because there's nothing really written by Tolkien other than a few things that they don't have the rights to and stuff that's in the appendices, right? So, and I did a little bit of digging. It turns out that originally what they were trying to get, Amazon, what they were trying to get is the rights to do the Lord of the Rings again. They were on the cusp, apparently, from what I can tell. I was digging very deep, so some of this stuff is conjecture, clearly, but it sounded like at the last minute the estate balked, and they decided it was too close to Peter Jackson's to start creating a competitor to which is what it would be. Now, by the way, just as an aside, I would be okay with seeing a long form version of the Lord of the Rings done for the screen, for a television screen. I would be really okay with that. Okay?
100%. Yeah.
Aside done. So, I don't know if this is something that they're not telling us or what, but I think this is what's happening. I think this is what this episode has made clear. This is a cinematic prequel to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. So we can't have blue wizards because that's too obscure. So you have to have Gandalf, because Gandalf is
Right.
the Maiar counterpart to Sauron in
Right.
The Lord of the Rings. So there's no other way you could do this. In spite of the fact that you have 50 hours to do this, they've limited themselves to a very small number of creative choices, because they have to correspond to, they have to evoke and lead to, and I bet you anything, the final scene of season 5 is going to be Smeagol grabbing the ring at the bottom of I bet you that's going to be the final scene of the whole thing. At which point it's just Rogue One, right? So we've just been doing Rogue One, but badly, because I like Rogue One. I think Rogue One's great.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Yeah. So I think not enough people are talking about this. And if that's the case, then actually that's a very disappointing thing. To make 50 hours worth of cinematic stuff costing $1 billion only to do a cinematic prequel to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings is a very limiting thing. I don't think it's interesting enough. I don't think it's worth doing.
If it is supposed to be that, there are once again a number of very perplexing choices that are, like, is this Galadriel really a good prequel version of the Galadriel we get in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings?
Well, clearly, because Sauron says that she's going to be stronger than the foundations of the earth.
Oh yeah. Oh,
okay.
That's right. I forgot they did the call.
Yeah. How could you forget?
So let's talk about the wizard battle.
Okay, let's do it.
This gets back to a problem, and the places where you talked about this, but the places where Jackson's adaptation failed are the places where it really mistook what magic is supposed to be, right? Yes. You can think of like Aragorn on my least favorite example of this is Aragorn on the skull roller coaster on the way out of the paths of the dead, like which is very dumb. It's very dumb.
Yeah, I hate that.
But the wizard battle with Saruman is another good example. Like, for some reason, the wizards' staffs in Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, have telekinetic powers, but only in this one scene. Never again. Like, you would think, oh, well, if you can just telekinesis somebody with your staff, like, wouldn't Gandalf be doing that all the time? Like, so, but apparently this is just a wizard duel thing, so I have questions about that. But also, like, this is not how magic in Tolkien's world works. It's more subtle than this.
Yeah.
You could have done, like a nice, if people really need their Kalevala references, a song battle would have been awesome.
Totally awesome. I love that scene, the Kalevala. It's just amazing.
Yeah, a song battle would have been cool. I mean,
that's so visual too.
Finrod and Sauron had a song battle, which
that's right. Yeah.
I guess technically they didn't have the rights, which we've talked about why I think that's a lame excuse. But in any case, they could have done. They didn't need the rights to that to kind of refer to it a little bit obliquely in the show. So they had some cool options, and they didn't take any of them. And what they decided instead to do was, here's a battle of telekinesis staffs.
Yep. No, there's only one staff.
One staff, but she's using it to like pick Gandalf up and turn him just like Saruman does. And again, this is just it's not how magic works in Tolkien's Legendarium. And I mean, I would say that if you can't see that, or if you can't see why this is a problem, then you're missing something really deep and fundamental to the Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah. The most powerful magical item in the Lord of the Rings is the One Ring.
Yeah.
And I defy anybody to specifically tell me what it does other than turning you invisible.
Which is not exactly,
and it doesn't do that for everyone.
That's right.
And it doesn't even do that for everyone, right?
That's right.
The actual way that the One Ring works, like if you only go off of the text of the Lord of the Rings, is extremely mysterious. It's never clear. And Verlyn Flieger, who's a very respected Tolkien scholar, she makes this point beautifully in a book of hers called Green Suns and Fairy, which is one of my favorite nightstand books. It's a great title. And it's just a book of essays about Lord of the Rings and her reading of it. And it's one of my favorite nightstand books because all the essays are like fairly short and really consumable and all worth a reread. It's really brilliant. And in one of those essays, she just looks at everything that's ever said about the ring in the Lord of the Rings. And she points out that one of the greatest sleights of hand of the entire book is making you think that the ring is magical.
Yeah.
And
that's so true. Wow, that's brilliant.
And yet you come away being like even the casual reader of Tolkien would be, oh yeah, this ring's a really big deal, right? Because it's so subtle and it's so beautifully kind of worked. It's so beautifully worked in, and this whole like, you know, picking people up off the ground and you know, making them.
I guess the argument can be made that you. I mean, you have a visual medium, right? And that's the argument everybody's going to be making. So how are you going to make a mysterious magical object mysterious in a visual medium? Well, it's certainly not by doing the wizard duel. That much I can
not that way. Yeah. Yes. There are ways to do this, and the Jackson trilogy does actually manage to handle some of them pretty well. But also there are lots of other examples of doing wondrous magical kinds of things. Miraculous, you could say, kind of things. Maybe miraculous is a better way to think about it.
I think so. I think that's true. Yeah.
You know, if you were watching like a movie that was supposed to be like, you know, here's a saint performing a miracle, and the saint like, you know, used his force powers to, you know, like, you know, I think that would be we would feel like that was a little cheap somehow. Not that there aren't some like pretty
they already do it, right? So I mean, the scene where Gandalf tries to heal the tree fails, then the Eleanor comes up, and the next morning everything is beautiful, and that's like it. That. You've done it. You've shown the magic. That's it.
Right.
That's how it works.
Yeah. So, but I understand they were trying to do like give us a big climax, because they hadn't. There
wasn't anything. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I mean, again, this is not the way, guys. This is not Tolkien. This is just,
you are a Mandalorian no more.
Yeah, you're taking the parts of the Jackson trilogy which are kind of the least Tolkien, and then you're trying to double back on them and do them again.
I mean, it's true. If you think about the Fellowship, three of I mean, I've said this already, but I will repeat it. 3 of the least effective scenes were scary Galadriel, the moth, and the wizard duel. I mean, scary Galadriel was not a good scene. It wasn't. It was badly done.
And they doubled down on that in The Hobbit, which was terrible.
Well, let's not talk. I pretend those things never happened. Come on, they don't exist.
Fair enough.
They exist in a parallel reality somewhere in the metaverse, but they're not real. I've decided. That's it. All right, so enough of that. Let's move on to the meaty stuff. Let's talk about Sauron, shall we?
Okay.
All right, where do you want to start?
Did you know that Halbrand was Sauron?
I had no idea.
Who could have seen this coming?
I had no idea. I'm so surprised.
Oh my gosh. I mean, they basically gave it away several episodes earlier. The
lustful look at the forge, that one?
The lustful look at the forge, he keeps asking Adar, do you know me? Do you recognize me? Mm-hmm. I'm still just going to go on record as saying I think this is not all of Sauron. I think Sauron is going to he's got to get his mojo back, and that's going to be season 2. I think that, you know, there's still something Adar did to him, which is why he's maybe, again, this is trying to make too much sense of things, but he seems like a little too mortal still.
Yes.
And so I think they're going to show that, you know,
even though 6 days of riding with a mortal wound on a horse, and he's fine. So, you know.
But also, you can't get from Mordor to Lindon in 6 days of hard riding, even if we didn't stop for any rest. Like, okay, even elf horses got to eat sometime, but sure, you didn't stop for rest. But even at top speed, riding day and night, you
with magic horses.
But again, at this point, I'm not expecting that the showrunners have ever like paid attention to the little scale part of a map of Middle Earth to say how many miles is it from here and what's the route that you would take, right? Which is a very important question in any Tolkien story, but not something that the showrunners are interested in. So yeah, man, where to start with this? So after giving us several episodes of trying to sell us Halbrand is actually, he's a reluctant Aragorn from the Jackson films type. They do this complete about face basically just in this episode.
Yeah.
And they had all of this foreshadowing, but it wasn't the kind of foreshadowing where you were like, oh, this feels ominous. It was like, well,
it was puzzle box.
they're
So
obviously lying
if it's a
to
red
us,
herring
and
or
it's
not.
not going to be. And so in that sense, like Halbrand's like just sudden reversal where like, oh, I'm evil now, guys.
It was fast, man. It was fast.
Did not feel in any way like believable, but also like in no way did it feel emotionally impacting.
Nope.
None of that stuff, right? And then we do the flashback scenes.
Oh God, the flashback scenes. Okay, my lord. Okay, this is a real problem.
So Halbrand turns into Finrod, or Sauron turns into Finrod in Galadriel's memories, and leans in for a kiss.
Yeah, while saying "touch my darkness."
Bro, I have language for this, and it's not repeatable. Like I was literally What the heck?
Yeah.
What the heck?
Yeah. I mean, this is wrong on so many levels. First of all, what does this mean about that scene in episode 1? Because we have to ask that. Unless we're just supposed to be stupid and say, "Oh, it's fantasy, everyth's possible," which is dumb. Let's just throw that out there. If that's gonna be your argument, just leave the room. Okay.
Tolkien would not have accepted that.
No fantasy writer worth their salt would ever do anything like that. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. Okay, so this is suggesting then what? What is it suggesting? That her memory is false? Maybe, right? So it's been tampered with, which means that Sauron can get into her head and control her thoughts, which is a very serious it's a very serious thing to do in storytelling. If you're going to make him into that kind of a villain,
right,
you have to really build that up, because that is not not a small thing. Control of someone's mind is a major thing.
You gotta sell us that. You gotta be like, oh, Sauron, the one who has the ability to enter the minds of men and turn them against each other.
I mean, yes, this is a huge deal.
That's exactly the super obvious level on which this show would have done something like that, by the way.
Right. Yeah. And they didn't even do that. So what does that mean then? Does that mean that he's controlling her memory of the event, or does it mean that he was there and shape shifted into Finrod at a certain point in her, like he was present and in order to set up this whole thing for like he knew that he was going to encounter her thousands of years in the future, so he'll put this seed of doubt in her head. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It does in no way, shape, or form.
Here's the problem: is that you are, as I've often been accused of doing, trying to make sense of this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In reality, here's what happened.
Okay.
This touch the darkness line comes up 4 times in the show.
Yeah.
Comes up in the prequel. It's kind of like the preamble to episode 1. Comes up again at the very end of episode 2 when she jumps into the water. Mm-hmm. Comes up again when she's talking to Halbrand at the forge.
Yep.
And then it comes up the fourth and final time in the scene.
Yeah, that's right. That's a lot.
It's a lot, and it's enough to say this is the leitmotif. This is the basic like metaphysical leitmotif of the season, right? Yeah. They bookended. They made sure it came up twice in the middle. So basically, every couple of episodes, we come back to this. You have to touch the darkness, kind of a thing. The first 3 times we are shown it, it's categorically true.
Right.
So, like according to the script, according to the canons of a story, it's a true statement. It's coming from a character who we're supposed to see as unambiguously positive in Galadriel's memory.
Yeah, whose death drives the entire action of the entire season.
Not, by the way, her husband, who's apparently just MIA, but not a big deal.
Yeah.
But
whatever.
But yeah, so the character whose death drives all of the action of the main character of season 1. So he's an important character. Mm-hmm. He says it. We're intended to believe this is true. She acts on it at the end of episode 2. We're intended to believe this is true. She says it to Halbrand, and it seems to be an important turning point for both of them.
Yeah,
we're
because
intended to believe
there's
it's
a bunch of this Providence talk in that scene, right?
Right.
It's played straight. This is one of those like pivotal
100%.
scenes in the entire thing. So you can't say that it was that they're putting it there to flip it.
So you come to the fourth
No.
use. And the question is, either are the writers so tone deaf that they didn't realize how it would undermine everything else they'd done to build that phrase up by putting it in the mouth of an either evil character, or are we expected to believe that actually Galadriel should have gone along with this? Those are the two options.
Yeah.
Those are the two options. It's either incompetent writing or, according to what Finrod said, Galadriel should actually touch the darkness here. She should join with Sauron.
Yeah.
And
because she could still save him.
And
she could still save him. Yep.
Yeah, and fix him. And that seems to be like the arc that they've set up here, and the one that I'll read some quotes from the showrunners here in a moment.
Yep.
That they seem to be painting is it's after he gets spurned by Galadriel.
Yeah.
Now he's going to, so he's not evil yet. He really wanted to heal Middle Earth, and of course for Sauron, healing Middle Earth means ruling it. But he really does want this. And if she would just join with him, then maybe she could have fixed him. And so the fact that she didn't, everything else he does from now on is partially her fault. So those are the two options.
I mean, it's more than partially. It's more than partially.
Right.
And before you read the quotes from the showrunners, I want to read this epic. It's insanely epic Twitter thread. Some of this I don't agree with, but just listen to this, because this is obviously an extreme view, but it's close enough to reality to make you really think. This is a thread on Twitter by some guy that I'm not going to repeat because his channel seems to be rather trollish, but still what he has to say is not untrue. Sauron didn't plan to get shipwrecked, trapped on a raft, and almost eaten by a sea worm twice. He didn't plan on meeting Galadriel, an elf who, astoundingly, had just jumped out of her ship to somehow swim the entire length of the Sundering Seas in the middle of the ocean. Sauron didn't plan to be rescued by Númenóreans. He didn't plan for Galadriel to refuse to believe that he'd stolen a symbol from a dead man, as he told her, and then insist that he was a king while he kept insisting he wasn't. He didn't plan to be out in prison for theft and assault. He didn't plan for Galadriel to somehow then convince Númenor to send ships to Middle-earth. He didn't plan to be caught in a pyroclastic flow from the eruption of Mount Doom. He didn't plan to be stabbed by a lance off-screen. He didn't plan to get an infected gut wound. He didn't plan for Galadriel to force him to ride 6 days to Eregion, or was it Lindon? I can't remember which one it was. A stronghold of his millennia-old enemies, by the way, to be under care of elven healers, who then, of course, have no idea that he's Maiar. He didn't plan for Celebrimbor to let him assist on a project he couldn't have known even existed. He didn't plan on some grand scheme to seize power. He didn't even lie to Galadriel. She orchestrated everything that happened to him, often in defiance of his own explicit requests. He was ignored because Galadriel always insists that she's right. Sauron didn't even plan on corrupting the rings. He didn't plan to assassinate Elrond or Gil-galad. He didn't plan to sabotage Celebrimbor's project or steal the Mithril or do anything he could have so easily done to ensure the elves would die or leave Middle-earth. I mean, these are supposed to be his enemies. Sauron didn't murder Galadriel when she confronted him about his true identity. Instead, he offered her to be the anchor for his redemption. Galadriel is furious. He wants to be a king to heal Middle-earth. You told the Southlands, Galadriel, that he was their king. What this show establishes in its utter fumbling incompetence and in defiance of the most basic of Tolkien's lore is that Sauron of the Third Age is entirely the creation of a deceitful, manipulative Galadriel, whose cruelty and rejection drive a repentant being back to evil. Boom! How's that?
Thanks, I hate it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
I mean, it is an extreme view of it, but there's nothing there that's wrong.
But there's nothing wrong about it, right? Like, nope. So let me read something that the showrunners had to say. This came from a Hollywood Reporter interview that Patrick McKay did, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay. They said, we felt Sauron should be a character in his own right. We wanted to study the currents running within him in a way that hopefully would reward audiences as they follow him moving forward as he becomes the Dark Lord. Mm-hmm. And then he adds, you know him as a person outside the name Sauron. In some ways, we wanted to do an origin story for Sauron. We didn't want to make a show that was about the hunt for Sauron, but we loved the idea of Sauron as a deceiver who could hopefully deceive some of the audience. And then he says this. Payne adds that the arc was inspired by the charismatic depiction of Satan in Paradise Lost. In Tolkien, Sauron is a deceiver, and we know that in the Second Age he appears in fair form. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So what if he sneaks up on you and is able to get you to sympathize with him and to get you to be on board with him so that once you actually realize who he is, he's already got his hooks in you, Payne opined. So it's not just as easy as this person is evil, I'm going to back away, because you've already formed some level of attachment to him. Yeah. What if we could get the audience to go through a similar journey? Right.
Yes,
and so
there's so much to say about this. My goodness.
Yeah. So the showrunners really do intend on a meta level to help you sort of fall in love with the devil.
Yeah.
So that you're more affected by, or sort of brought along with, his journey into evil.
So I want you to talk about specifically why referencing Milton's Satan is such a bad idea with reference to Tolkien. But first, before we say that, I want to establish one very important thing, because this is something that not enough people are saying with enough nuance. Okay, if you subscribe to the idea that, which is implicit in this comment that McKay makes, that Tolkien's characterizations of evil are black and white, that's effectively what you're subscribing to, that he has no nuance in his writings, in his depictions of good and evil. It's all black, it's all white. Who makes that argument all the time? George R.R. Martin is the one who makes this argument all the time. That's the reason why Game of Thrones is the way it is, because Martin has been on record with this. He says that he can't get out from underneath the shadow of the Lord of the Rings. He loves the Lord of the Rings, but it doesn't fit his worldview. So all of his characters are the exact opposite: gray, 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 gray. But of course, we all know, any of us who have read Lord of the Rings, and especially the Silmarillion, that there's no such thing as an absolutely black or an absolutely white character, except for who? Morgoth and Sauron. Okay? And that's on purpose, because Tolkien's very clear. You cannot have sympathy with the devil because of Milton, because there are very serious problems with the kind of devil that Milton wrote. Tolkien was very cognizant of this sort of tradition.
Right.
Very cognizant. He's doing this on purpose. Right. So if you are taking Tolkien's Sauron and turning him into a nuanced villain, you are doing something that, by the way, I like to do in my own fiction. I like to nuance villains. This is almost unavoidable in modern fantasy, almost. But Tolkien does it too. Look at Maeglin, look at Eowl, look at Denethor, look at Boromir. All right, he does this very well. But you have to have an ultimate evil, because you have to establish the existence of an ultimate evil that cannot be bent towards the good. Otherwise, there's no point to any of it. So that I need to establish that, right? So as a appreciator and lover of fantasy, and as a writer of fantasy, I accept that you can have nuanced villains. You should, but not Sauron. Not Sauron. Anyway.
And not Morgoth.
Definitely not.
Yeah. So I would like to begin by taking some shots at Milton.
Please do.
Yeah, which, I've read the Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained both several times. I read them the first when I was about 10 years old.
Wow.
And really thought they were really rad at the time, because I was like, man, this is some dope Bible fan fiction right here. Like, this is really cool. And then as I've grown older, I've fallen out of love with them. And let me try to explain why. Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. First of all, there's a reason almost nobody reads Paradise Regained. Everyone has to read Paradise Lost in school at some point if you get a certain kind of degree. People who actually read and enjoy Paradise Regained. I've met people who have claimed to have read Paradise Regained. I was like, cool, tell me something about it. What's your favorite part? And they're like, so anyway, I don't think people really read it. But one of the big problems with Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained is that they suffer from a lack of protagonist. Mm-hmm. So epic poems typically have protagonists. The Odyssey is a great example of, there's a protagonist. His name is Odysseus. His name is on the label, and it's his story, right? The Iliad has more of an ensemble cast, but it still has certain key characters who you can follow. And it's the decisions of those characters, doomed for good or for ill, that drive the plot forward, right? Beowulf has a protagonist, so on and so forth, right? Well, the problem is that Milton is a Calvinist. Calvinism is the low-grade migraine that all Western civilization suffers from, in my opinion. But the problem is that Milton is a Calvinist, and as such, the character of Adam doesn't actually have any agency in the story.
Yep.
Right. Everything, and it's, in this, for the same reason, God is not a compelling protagonist for the story.
Yeah. Well, how can God be a compelling protagonist for a Calvinist? I don't understand.
Right.
That's a different conversation, maybe.
Yeah, different conversation. Yeah. But and so what ends up happening is that the most compelling character in Paradise Lost is Satan.
Clearly, yeah.
He's the one that chooses, right? Now, a Calvinist would say even the devil doesn't really have free choice, but anyway, the point is, he's the one who is really portrayed
within
as
the limits of his freedom. He does
Right.
he does
Right.
drive a lot of action.
Right. So he's the one that makes the choices that actually drive the action of the story. He's the one that
Mhm.
actually makes the choices that matter. And his whole better to reign in hell than to be a slave in heaven speech is one of the most compelling passages in the whole story.
It's one of the most compelling passages in Western literature.
And it's
one of the most influential passages in Western literature.
One of the most influential. And that is a real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real problem. It has had a reverberating effect on all literature since.
Yep.
That written in the English language. And I think that you can, that's, for me, this is why the great Christian epic is not Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Which is profoundly unchristian in so many ways, but it's the Divine Comedy, right? If you want, the
totally.
great Christian epic poem, it's the Divine Comedy, and then after that, it's Lord of the Rings.
I agree.
But
and by the way, Lord of the Rings is, I think, on some level, an answer to Milton.
I think you're right. Because one of the things that Tolkien really understands. So there's that line. You're Russian, so I assume you've read Anna Karenina.
Yes.
I just assume every Russian person. Every Russian person has obviously read that book. No, but the first line of Anna Karenina always goes something like, what is it like? Good people are all the same, but bad people are all bad in their own interesting ways, or something, right?
It's something like
that. But that's a profoundly untrue statement about the situation of the world. Yeah. Actually, it's the saints who are all interesting and diverse.
Yeah.
Evil is banal.
Yeah.
And it's just the same. And if you don't believe me, then
all you have to do is pay attention to the history of the 20th century.
Pay attention to the history of the 20th century. Pay attention to
all do the same thing.
I mean, there are tons and tons of examples of is pornography, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the great scourges of our time. The devil's iconography, as Father Seraphim Rose called it, right?
That's right.
Yeah, all of the point, all of this stuff is deeply banal. It's all the same at the end of the day, right? Because it always leaves you in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien understood this about evil.
Yeah.
And so he understood that the interesting thing is not to make evil interesting, but rather it's to show the struggle against it, right? To show the struggle. Boromir goes through that struggle, right? Boromir has a deathbed repentance and confession.
That's what makes it so good.
Right? Yeah. And Boromir is not a bad character,
no,
but he's weak and he falls. And then he has this sort of last deathbed confession to Aragorn. He has repentance, and it's this really beautiful, actually really sacramental moment. The whole funeral of Boromir is this deeply beautiful sacramental moment, which I think that the Jackson films captured quite well,
and brilliantly put it at the end of Fellowship instead of the beginning of Two Towers.
Yes.
One of the best decisions they made. Absolutely.
Yes. Brilliant. Agreed. Yeah. And so so the problem is that many people have just profoundly misunderstood this.
Yeah.
And this is really unfortunate in the context of something like The Rings of Power or Game of Thrones, etc., because it's one of the great virtues of fantasy that it is able to show us evil in this way. I mean, if you read,
you can get away with it. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. If you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe,
mm-hmm.
right? Has there ever been a better villain in a book than the White Witch? No. There's nothing relatable about her, right? Mm-mm. And yet every single one of us who has read that book honestly could say, I probably would have done what Edmund did in his place, like,
Yeah.
the whole she's going to give me treats and she's going to tell me the things that I want to hear about myself. And and so the thing is, the character we sympathize with in that book is Edmund. It's not
Yeah.
the witch, it's Edmund.
Yep.
And it's
Yep.
Edmund's struggle, right? To get out of
And
her clutches.
No, but let's drive this point a little bit deeper. She does get a 4-story, right? She does get a prequel, and it in no way makes her in any way more appealing. It makes her worse.
Although Uncle Andrew did believe to his dying day that she was a dem fine woman, sir. A dem fine woman. I've read that book a lot of times, if you can't tell.
It's a good book.
Yeah, I love those books. But yeah, so I mean, same thing with the characters in the villain, the Green Lady in the silver chair, who's of that kind of same breed, This is what fantasy is for. Tolkien, right. Or Lewis says in one of his essays about fairy story, he says that one of the great virtues of this kind of literature is that things can wear their outsides on their insides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we can say in real life, yes, most people, like, there's that famous Solzhenitsyn quote, like, wouldn't it be convenient if the lines were always clear and easy to see? And sometimes, I mean, you've got your, the great mass murderers of the 20th century, Hitler and Stalin and so forth. You can look at that person and say, yeah, that guy's evil, right? Yeah. That guy's evil. That guy's bad. Or you can look at Judas. You can look at other, characters, and you can say, that's a bad guy. That guy's evil. But for most people, it's not that simple. It's not that easy, which is why we need fantasy.
Well, what you're saying is really interesting in that in fantasy, it's not an either or proposition.
Right,
it's
100%.
An if and, right? So you could have both. You could have the nuanced gray kinds of characters who are very appealing to a modern audience. You can have an approachable and interesting villain, but those kinds of characters become better and more compelling if they exist against a backdrop of ultimate evil. This is the only reason that Game of Thrones as a series is as effective as it is. It's because of the White Walkers.
Right.
Because they are evil. They are ultimate evil that has no rational basis in existence. It's just going to come and eat you, right? So then all that stuff that's going on in King's Landing and all that stuff, it's against the backdrop of the ultimate evil, and it becomes much more compelling. It's much more than just the squabbling of very annoying and stupid people. Because you're invested in the survival of the world, because it's all going to die. Everybody's going to turn into zombies. So it's all of this stuff is disingenuous. It's unfair of people to make these complaints about Tolkien being black and white, because he's not, because he does the thing right. He gives you both. He gives you the ultimate of the white, the ultimate of the black, and then he allows you to play in the middle a lot, and it's really compelling. But this stuff.
And so the problem with this is that it actually brings that scale. It brings the whole story down.
Yes.
Right. And brings the whole story down to so to go on, if I could real quick, he just says, like Tony Soprano or Walter White, he's evil, but complexly evil. Right. And so, I mean, they're openly saying this show is going to be Breaking Bad for Sauron.
That's right.
Right. So that's going to be season 2. That's what they're planning on season 2 being. Yep. And unless Amazon steps in and says the ratings aren't what we want to see, we're going to slap your hand. You got to do something better, which is apparently what they've done with Wheel of Time. Maybe
too late.
Oh,
I hope so.
Yeah. Apparently the showrunners for Wheel of Time, after the terrible reviews that season 1 got their hands smacked and said, you got to do a better job. So we'll see what happens here. But at this point, I mean, this is what the viewers themselves have said, is this is where we're going. Sauron is the Walter White of this franchise,
which is insane. I mean, I have no desire to watch that show.
Me neither. And if that's
to do with Lord of the Rings,
if that's what it's going to be, Tolkien. I mean, this gets back to, will I watch season 2? Kind of depends.
Yeah.
If they keep charging ahead in the direction that the show has been going, then no. And a lot of people have said, well, the show's just not for you. It's for ... Well, at some point, you're right. The show is not for me.
Yeah.
And that is, I'm fine with that. That's okay. You can't take away my enjoyment of the books.
No. No,
You
but
can't
ultimately, you can't, in the same sentence, say this show is not for you, but
Right.
it is for people who understand and appreciate Tolkien for being Tolkien.
Right.
This is no longer Tolkien. If they
Yeah.
do this, and they could do this with anyone else. I will again. How many times during this miniseries that we've had here have I said that the by far the best character is Adar? I've said it again and again and again. He's an excellent character. It's a very interesting storyline. I have no problem with nuanced bad guys. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
But pause off Sauron.
Yeah.
Just stop it, because you've put yourself in an impossible position. In order to make Sauron this kind of Sauron, you have to make Galadriel into the villain. And you're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to have both ways, and it's not working. And you know what, for me, the worst scene of the entire 8 episodes was Galadriel coming in after she almost dies, coming into Celebrimbor's forge, saying Halbrand isn't coming back, and then not admitting her fault and trying to forge ahead with the forging of the rings, and I don't know, pretending like she didn't do anything wrong.
And she tells Elrond, you're not allowed to ask me that question and be a good friend. Like,
what
the heck?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was very strange. Why would she just come and be like, guys, I was right, Sauron's back.
So
like, this is your big moment, Galadriel.
I mean, she gives her sword in. So this is, are you going to do something more than just the physical action that's supposed to represent an internal change? Because that's what it's supposed to do. The physical action is supposed to represent an internal change. She didn't have that internal change. And they're committing to it, because in that same article, they're talking about how season 2 is going to be the repercussions of Galadriel's decision on Galadriel. Galadriel's going to be in trouble in season 2. Like, I don't want to watch this. Like, what? Why? We've had enough of Galadriel as villain and Sauron as good guy, who, almost good guy, for this entire season. I'm sick of it. Are we going to go like lean into that aspect of this in season 2? Is this going to be the backbone of season 2? Are you out of your mind? This is the one thing that is the least Tolkien in the entire thing that you've done. I mean, there's so many other things you could focus on. Spend more time in with the dwarves. I mean, please go there.
People seem to like it.
I mean, even Numenor, there's so much more you could do with Numenor. Not once did we have anything about the Kingsmen, and the references to the faithful were more about a generic kind of faithful that has to do with kind of belief in something. And
there's like a really weird. There is like a really weird kind of like sideways nature to all of that, where over and over again, it seems like what the show is telling us that actually, the elves are bad for Numenor. Like, it's very, it's very, it's very hard to kind of track with what's the message? Like, what are the,
well, they're contradicting each other constantly.
Yeah, what's the moral framework that the show is trying to communicate?
What moral framework? And again, this is getting back to that original article that we've mentioned several times from the New York Times, about not creating a Tolkien multiverse, is that if you're going to take on the job of creating a massive work of entertainment that is based on Tolkien's work, at the very least, what you can do is do what Peter Jackson did and say explicitly, we're going to try to bring his vision to the screen out of respect for the professor. He called him the professor, capital P. I mean, I know from conversations that he has had in other outlets that he and I do not share a worldview at all, Peter Jackson and I. And still, the Lord of the Rings series is some of the best cinematography, some of the best cinematic stuff that I've ever seen. I like those movies a lot. And here we have these people who are not successful writers, who have no backlist of works that they've practiced on, and who aren't even trying to remain true to the vision. All they do is pay lip service in the absolute literal meaning of that. They pay lip service and then they go do whatever the heck they want.
Yeah.
And when you call them out on it, instead of trying to give a reasoned response for why they did this, they immediately virtue signal and call you insert, demonized group here. This is classic propaganda.
Right.
That's what it is. This is how propaganda works. This is not art. It's not even trying to be art.
Right.
But the worst thing about it is that they don't realize it's propaganda. They think they're doing entertainment. Otherwise, why would they be spending all this time and energy to do it? There'd be no point. Nobody wants to spend 60 million an episode to do propaganda. Nobody, not even the ones who are doing it. There are much cheaper and more effective ways of doing propaganda than spending 3.5 years of your life in extremely, tense conditions doing all this for insane amounts of money.
Yeah.
They clearly don't have the knowledge, the life experience, the writing ability to do this. And it's just becoming clearer and clearer the more they're opening their mouths. And it's really disappointing. I am disappointed by this. Yeah. I don't want to hate on them. I want to sit and enjoy a work of art inspired by my favorite author. I want this more than anything. Wake up, people.
Yeah, you think that they think that we're looking at this thing cynically and just like looking for stuff to hate. Like, no, that's not how we operate at all. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's my review of season 1 as well. And it is quite interesting to see, like, now that the shine is worn off a little bit, especially with that last episode, a lot of news outlets, media outlets and whatnot have kind of come out and said, you know what, actually first season was pretty bad. Yep. And I don't always agree with them on the reasons they think it's bad or the parts they think are good. But I think the general critical consensus has been
tilting back in the
$60 million an episode should have been better, right? And even going back to things like the lazy CGI that we talked about.
I mean, it's bad. Chihuahua Warg is not good.
Chihuahua oh my gosh, Chihuahua Warg was so bad. It's so dorky. And if I could just talk about like what, in the face of everything you just said, this will seem like a small nitpick, but I just have to get it in before we finish this review.
Get it off your chest.
So the mithril thing.
Oh God.
So the mithril thing came out in that episode. It was like episode 5, I think. And a lot of people who have been going to bat for the show for reasons that are difficult for me to understand in terms of like why they would feel like Amazon needs their needs them to defend it. But a lot of people going to bat for the show said, oh, this is obviously a ploy. Sauron has deceived the elves into thinking this mithril thing is true.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be really true. Obviously, the showrunners are smart. They know the lore. They know that's not how magic works in Tolkien. They know that's not how the ring, et cetera, et cetera. What I said at the time was that, no, this is how they're going to get to the rings. They're going to make the rings out of mithril, and this is how that's going to be explained.
Yeah.
And that obviously the elves do forge the rings to slow or kind of stop their fading, right? So that much is accurate. Now, manifesting is like black goo on trees, like whatever. But I mean, that is why they forged the rings. I said, no, I think this whole thing is going to be genuine. And actually, one of the things that I said, I don't think I said it in this review, but I said it in a discussion with somebody else, is my prediction is they're not going to be able to get the mithril that they need. And so the shortage of mithril is going to be why they go with rings, because they
you
can
called
make...
it. You called it.
So all of that ended up being true. But even with the previous episode where they showed like the leaf is healed, and then it floats down and gets burned up by a Balrog.
Yeah.
Very, very kind of whatever scene. But I said, well, see, look right here, it works. And they said, no, that's still part of Sauron's delusion. So, like, people were sticking by their guns on the whole mithril thing. Yeah. And then in this final episode, it's extremely clear. No, they're going with this. This is how this works.
Yeah.
And they decided to double down on this by getting Celebrimbor, the greatest elven smith who's ever lived, second greatest, I guess, who's ever lived, to really double down on this and say, we need a circular shape so that the light can double back on itself and become like this infinite powerhouse. It's the arc reactor from Iron Man.
I know.
Like, that's what they went with.
Yep.
And to me, this was it was frustrating on a number of levels. One is because I was told I was cynical for thinking the mithril thing was legit.
Yep.
Another reason that it was really frustrating to me is again, because simply this is not how magic works. There's a reason Tolkien never wrote a scene where the rings of power were actually being forged. It's much more mythically powerful to say these great magical rings were forged than to tell us. And so to forge the rings, they built a pressure chamber with enough power to fuse heaven and earth.
Oh, by the way, what about his extremely important forge that never got built?
Oh, okay. So this is another little weird continuity error. And somebody pointed this out to me and said, "Hey, did you notice this?" And I said, "Yeah, I noticed it, and it seemed very strange to me." This is my buddy Alypius. Oh, and also because I want to credit to my buddy John Matthew for sending me that Hollywood Reporter article earlier today, which I'd not seen, and once I saw it, I was like, ah. But so in the first one of the earlier scenes when they go back to Eregion, right, you see the half-finished tower in the background. But then in the scene right before they forge the rings, they're in a finished tower, and the finished tower has ivy on it, like it's been there for a while. So my question is, did they forge this thing in the giant special forge tower, or was that just a plot thread they forgot to resolve?
The latter. It was the latter.
In either
they ran out of money. They ran out of money. That's what it was.
That's not the case. They have unlimited money. So in either case, this is like a major continuity problem. Like either, and a classic example of like violating the first rule of good writing, right? The whole Chekhov's gun thing, right?
Yes.
If you sell me, I need a giant elven tower in the very first episode or second episode, whichever one it was. I think it was the first. If you sell me, I need a giant elven tower in the first episode. By the time you get to the eighth episode, and we're forging magical rings in an elven tower, it better be that first tower, or you should have explained why we abandoned work on it, or like tie that off, pay that off. And that's just another example of the kind of like the really inattentive. I think that's the word I'm going to go with here. It sounds nicer than sloppy.
Ultimately, they didn't even really say what it was that he wanted to do. Right? What was his project? What was the thing that he was going to forge that he needed the massive forge for? Because it wasn't the rings. It wasn't even a crown. It was something else. But what was it? Grond? Was he going to make Grond?
It was supposed to be like the great work that was going to like, but they and you know as the viewer that is supposed to be a hint at the forging of the rings later, but then they come up with this other completely tedious, really, really silly story of how the rings actually got forged, and so they never pay that 5 minutes. Yeah, and so they never pay that first one off. And the rings are forged in 5 minutes, and it's really this goofy scene so that we can get the mithril. My favorite, you talked about liking the Nazgals. My favorite new coinage for the show has been the mithril chlorians.
yes, the
because it functions in exactly the same way that the midichlorians in the Star Wars prequel films did, which was taking something that was like pretty cool. There's a force, and some people can manipulate it, and it's like basically you have magic, right? You have space magic, like Zen Buddhist space magic, right? And they take that and they were like, oh, it's actually because you have all these like little bacteria organisms in your body, and you can measure somebody's midichlorian count and find out like how much magic. By the way,
everybody hated, and nobody was on Lewis's side.
Everyone hated it.
He was the only person. He still is the only person who thinks it's a good idea.
Everyone hated it, and all Star Wars adaptations since then have chosen, rightly so, to completely forget about it. And this is the equivalent of that. And I hope that when they get to episode 2, they just decide to, or season 2, they decide to completely forget about this, because
there might be a lot of retconning going on in season 2.
It's totally possible, but again, shouldn't be necessary for the most expensive TV show ever made. Could have afforded to get it right the first time. So
exactly. So anyway. Will we watch it? I think the jury is still out, but at this point, if it becomes clear that we're continuing Milton's Satan and Galadriel as supervillain, then I'm out. And the only way that I'm going to change that is if the promotional materials make it clear that we're going in a different direction. So the trailers might change my mind when we get there. Of course, it's going to be in a long time, but judging by the by their track record on trailers, that's unlikely because the trailers were the weakest part of all of the stuff that they did. They were really
and
bad.
they've said that it's going to be probably 2 or 3 years before we get another season, which
Right.
might be code for well, we got a lot of reworking and rethinking to do, which I honestly hope happens. Again, I want this to be good. I've never wanted it to be bad. And I don't have a lot of patience for people who said, well, I'm not going to watch it at all because it's terrible. Well,
no.
Now you can say that because you can go look at reviews and say maybe this is not worth my time. But initially, like, I mean, how are you going to know unless you watch it? So
well, the only other way is to listen to us opine about it, and of course, we're very grateful that you were here listening. And we needed to get all this off our chests. If you didn't know,
still frosty over the mithril thing. If you could not tell, like, it seems like a small sin in light of so many of the other like structural problems with the show. But again, to me, it's a matter of heart. It's the perfect example of how they don't understand the source material.
They just don't.
And so they're drawing upon a well of inspiration that's not the source material. It's some combination of Peter Jackson films and kind of the Marvels, the MCU zeitgeist that
and generic fantasy of the 80s and 90s and 2000s. That's it.
Yeah, but I think the MCU, like, that's the generic fantasy now.
Yeah, right.
And if you think about this, this whole mithril thing is a really good example. Mm-hmm. If you'd taken all of that stuff and put it in a Thor movie, nobody would have noticed.
It's true.
They'd been like, oh yeah, there are these like this ancient demon and he hit a rock.
Yep.
And it's magical now, and we need a bunch of it to make a thing.
Yeah.
And but we don't have enough to go around, so Iron Man has to figure out a way to forge it in a circle. And you can just imagine a scene like,
actually that'd be kind of cool, to be honest.
But the thing is, like, it works in that genre. But like, if you just imagine that scene where they're having that conversation with Gil-galad, but now instead it's Gil-galad is Captain America.
Yep.
And then it's Iron Man and Bruce Banner talking about how do we forge this thing.
Yeah, totally.
And they say, oh, we need something. And then Iron Man says, if we did this, if it was round, if it was a circle, if it was circular, then actually the power would loop back on itself. And it would, and they're like, okay, so what are we going to forge? A crown? No, we don't have enough to go around. A ring. And I did think they had like a decently cool explanation for why we decided to do 3 rings.
Yeah, that was okay. Yeah.
That was, of the nice things to say about this episode, that was a nice little thing. But you can see that scene happening in the MCU. Clearly, it's got no business being in a Tolkien story.
Yeah,
and the fact that somebody did tells me that no, actually, these guys don't care about the lore. And
I'm not even sure that they've read much of it. I mean, this
is like
I think all of us
Wikipedia
have read more than
level.
They have. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a good place to end. So unfortunately, we can't say more
positive
things about it. But hey, there's I
promised at the outset that I would be honest.
Yeah. And we are. So there you go. Richard and I will be back at some point in the near or far future to talk about Dune, and that's going to be a lot more of positive ranting. So
I need to go watch it like 3 times before we do that.
Well, yes, because if we're going to be talking on this level, then we really need to get into all the details, like that awesome statue of the bull before we even know that they're toreadors. One of the best bits of world building. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. So that's it for Rings of Power. And thanks for listening.